Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior. This is your host, Lawrence Neal, where it is my purpose to talk to the experts and get details on their daily routines, exercise and dietary regimens, how they do what they do so well. I pick their brains on the subjects they excel in to fast forward you to become more productive and successful in terms of your own health, business and lifestyle. Corporate Warrior is also the #1 podcast for high-intensity strength training, a form of resistance training made popular by the late Arthur Jones in the 70s and 80s. Guests range from high-intensity training pioneers like Dr. Doug McGuff and John Little to big-time health and fitness entrepreneurs like Ben Greenfield and Mark Sisson, all the way through to extreme endurance racers, productivity specialists, biomechanics experts, and many more. The next guest is best-selling nutrition and science writer Gary Taubes. Gary is the author of Nobel Dreams, Bad Science, A Short Life and Weird Times of Cold Fusion, Good Calories, Bad Calories, also known as a Diet Delusion. His book, Why We Get Fat and What We Do About It, and more recently, The Case Against Sugar. The kind of stuff we cover in this one includes diet controversies in terms of, we talk about high-fat, low-carb versus high-carb, low-fat, how to interpret scientific literature and some effective ways you can learn to identify good science. We talk about the diet wars, for example. Is Taubes better off pursuing research in how ketogenic diets may help cure cancer and have an indirect effect on diet opinions in that way? And Gary also goes into his personal life in terms of his own exercise regimen and participation in high-intensity training. And we talk about much, much more. Please do give this one 10 minutes to warm up. I was pretty nervous. Obviously, Gary has a pretty large reputation. And just take it from me, guys. If you are thinking about starting a podcast, just keep it simple. I tried to kick this one off with some elaborate intro into low-carb controversy. And it was just a bit confusing and a bit too ambitious and not very productive. But thankfully, Gary was very accommodating and we had great rapport. And hopefully, you'll see a side to Gary in this one that you may not have heard much before. He does go into a fair amount of his personal life, and I do think you see a very unique side to Gary in this one. All of the show notes and links will be in the usual place on corpwarrior.com. Just search Gary Taubes, Taubes. It's a proud moment for Corporate Warrior. Please enjoy my conversation with Gary Taubes. So, Gary, welcome to Corporate Warrior. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I wanted to kick off with being, I suppose, a little bit of a devil's advocate, and this was kind of unintentional at first. It was a difficult podcast to prepare for, not just because of your reputation, but because of how much my own beliefs were challenged. This probably won't surprise you, but when I reached out to my audience and asked them what they wanted me to ask you, there were some who didn't agree with your views. Okay. So for a long time now, just to give you a bit of context on my background, I've followed Tim Ferriss's slow carb diet and sort of loosely followed the recommendations made by Dave Asprey and moved more towards high fat and kind of played around, but I've always been kind of low carb in the way I eat. And, having read stuff about that and watched numerous presentations from smart people like yourself, I pretty much felt completely convinced that carbohydrate was the sort of fat gain culprit. But now, in some ways, having had people throwing articles and literature at me left, right and centre, I feel a little bit undecided. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start off by just running through a few common claims from the low-carb community that the opposition, for want of a better label, regard as myths, and just get your point of view on that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Cool, okay.
At least it is now. We'll see how it proceeds.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are some claims which are from the point of view of the sort of low carb diet opposition, if you will. So they claim it is a myth that a high carbohydrate diet leads to chronically high insulin levels, and they claim it's a fact that insulin is only elevated during the time after a meal in healthy individuals. What are your thoughts on those two statements?
Wait, who's making this claim?
So this is a claim from the low carb diet opposition. So the calories in, calories out crowd, I suppose, for the most part.
Okay. Repeat the claim again. Now that I asked who.
Yeah, sure.
Who was saying it? Yeah,
sure. So
it's a little bit like a quiz show now. I feel like
it's just there won't be too many.
Correctly, I get a prize.
Yeah, there won't be too much of this. I'm just really curious though. So they claim that a high carbohydrate diet leads to chronically high insulin levels. Is a myth. They claim that that's a myth, and it's fact that insulin is only elevated during the time after a meal in healthy individuals.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree the first one is a myth, and I'd agree that the second one is probably true. I mean, you could define healthy individuals as the fact that their insulin is only elevated after a meal and not throughout much of the day. They're clearly not insulin resistant then, right? So that's how we're going to define health at the moment as not insulin resistant. As for the first one, yeah, I mean, I'm not. The world is full of people who eat high-carb meals and don't manifest insulin resistance. I mean, Southeast Asia is your black swan there, right? So, but that's not the point. The point has always been the effect of, highly processed grains and sugars, or refined carbs and sugars, on insulin resistant status. And for those people who become insulin resistant and so obese and diabetic and everything that goes with it, do they do so because of the sugars, the refined processed grains, all easily digestible carbs? Clearly in this latest book, I'm arguing that sugar is the prime suspect. But you can clearly eat a high-carb diet and not become insulin resistant, because for, hundreds to thousands of years, most of the people in Southeast Asia did, in places that always amazes me. Like, whenever I'm giving a lecture and somebody brings up the Taubes, I feel like, oh my God, I'm in, like, the clearly populations that ate high-carb diets that were fine. So then the question is, if they're not fine today, what did you have to add to their high-carb diets to produce metabolic disturbances, of which the most obvious is insulin resistance? And again, in this latest book, I'm arguing that's sugar, or sugars, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, etc. Does that make sense? Did I answer correctly? Do I win prize?
I'm afraid there's no prize at the moment, but thank you for entertaining what was a very long and drawn out question. So I appreciate the answer. Okay. Cool.
It's one of the ways I realized, especially talking about in the last 2 weeks, so I've recently been on a somewhat exhausting book tour, which is partially why I'm having trouble keeping my eyes open at the moment. These issues get so confounded by questions of, like, what's a healthy diet and what we eat, and I do this and I'm healthy, therefore if everyone did this, they would be healthy too, and if they're not healthy, that's because they didn't do this. And the question, so you got to be very specific about what question you're asking, because if you're not specific about what question you're asking, then the answer could be incorrect, right? So the question I'm asking in this latest book is the observation is we have these epidemics of obesity and diabetes worldwide, and they occur sooner or later after a transition to a Western diet and lifestyle. And then the question is, what what is it about that Western diet and lifestyle, the nutrition transition that they go through that triggers these epidemics, okay? Clearly genes are related, but we see the same epidemics in populations that, from virtually effectively every population in the world that makes this transition. So it doesn't matter if it's Inuits or Maasai in Africa, or agrarian populations, or South Pacific Islanders, or Middle Easterners. In every population, the world seems to have people whose genotypes are susceptible to whatever this environmental trigger is. So the question is, what's the environmental trigger that causes the obese and diabetic phenotypes to manifest from whatever the underlying genotypes are? And, I'm saying it's sugar, not just high-carb diets, because you could have a high-carb diet that has low sugar consumption, and they're clearly fine. So that's the question. Then there are other questions about how do you reverse it? Does what happens for everyone happen for, anyway.
Got it. Yeah, I can see now why that can be. My question was kind of almost like a straw man argument sort of thing there. So
you get a lot of vigorous taking down of straw men in this business. I was just writing a response to a criticism I had of an essay on Cato Unbounded, where I referred to the respondee as vigorously defeating his straw man. The question is, can we discuss the real arguments and not the straw man arguments?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And with that in mind, I'm going to skip a few questions. This is a little bit off topic, but something that I guess I'm quite interested in at the moment for myself. And I think a lot of sort of layman people like me would like to, I suppose, be able to hack this, for want of a better word. So it's going to sound a bit like sacrilege, but I personally find it quite hard to find the time or motivation to read scientific studies, which is probably why I stick to interviewing people and asking questions and reading books from people like you. Assuming,
I'm going to interrupt for a second. The benefit of being a journalist over all these years, which is slightly better than doing the podcast, is I too didn't have to read most of the studies. I could call up the researchers and spend hours, if necessary, on the phone with them, having them talk me through their work and then questioning them that way.
Right.
One of the ways I've often been attacked over the years is people don't realize that much. I'm a journalist fundamentally, and so until the internet came along, the way we worked was by calling people up. We weren't supposed to have read 30 of their papers before we called them, because we couldn't get 30 of their papers. Now you can download everything. So I'm sympathetic. Back to the sacrilege.
Sort of paradox of choice, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, assuming one can't get reliable data any other way than actually, reading scientific studies and going through the methods, do you have any tips on how you review science efficiently for maximum gain, in addition to what you just said?
I'm going to tell you a story that goes back to my very first book, because I'm going to argue that you can't even get that information from the papers.
Right.
My first book, I went off to Geneva. This was 1985, to live at CERN, the big physics laboratory outside of Geneva, where they recently discovered the Higgs boson. And I was writing about, I thought I was going to be covering a great discovery. This physicist I had interviewed was about to win the Nobel Prize, and he said he was on to for earlier work, and he said he was on to the biggest discovery in physics in 40 years. All he had to do was turn on his accelerator and get a little more data. So I asked him if I could live at the lab, basically be embedded with the physicists, as we call it today, so that I could follow this breakthrough without having to be as smart as, I could write a book like The Double Helix without having to be as smart as Crick or Watson. And as soon as I got there, within a month of getting there, I realized there was something dramatically wrong with this experiment, which is that there are 150 physicists working on this experiment and numerous technicians, and a lot of the experiments didn't believe that a lot of the physicists didn't believe that the breakthrough was correct. That they believed that they had almost assuredly screwed up, but they weren't getting a voice in writing the papers because they were perceived by this Nobel laureate as being naysayers and critics and too skeptical and just not the kind of guys he liked working with. So he had surrounded himself by these young physicists who had come just to interpret the data. They hadn't built the equipment. They didn't know how it could screw up like these other guys did. And anyway, the gist of it is this physicist, this Nobel laureate, was not well liked, particularly by his colleagues. So I could travel around Europe and the U.S. talking to other physicists about him, and they were happy to explain to me how he screwed up and how his papers were deceptive. And one of them, a Nobel laureate at the Fermi National, who ran the Fermi National Laboratory outside of Chicago, said to me he liked to walk around the laboratory at night and talk to the graduate students because they hadn't learned how to lie yet. And one of my, I've often been accused back when I was, actively reporting articles. I would, my first piece on dietary fat, I spoke to about 150 people for one magazine article. After I did that, I did a fraud investigation where I talked to every single individual who had ever entered, well, I'm exaggerating, virtually everyone who had ever entered the laboratory of the researcher who his colleagues and fellow graduate students thought he was committing fraud. Now, his mentor was publishing these papers happily because they supported his mentor's position. His colleagues, the other graduate students, were pretty confident he was faking the data. So you had to talk. And again, here's an advantage that a journalist has. So if you just read the paper, you have no idea what they're really doing. You got to trust them. And you're supposed to trust them. You're supposed to trust that they're being good scientists. Now that I've had the experience through the Nutrition Science Initiative of funding studies, I see that even good scientists tend to make decisions, ad hoc, on the run, that might lead them to report data better than they, to make the data look a little better than the data should really look. And there's not actually any place in the paper where you can be, if you were horribly honest about all the ways you could have screwed up, the paper's going to be, 10,000 words long when there are, you say, 4,000 word limits. So, that said, you have to end up basically being skeptical of everything. And something Richard Feynman said was, I often quote Feynman because he was a physicist who at least put these thoughts. He said, science isn't about what's proving what's true or what's false. It's about saying what's more or less likely. And what we're doing always is saying, I think this is more likely than that, based on how I assess the evidence. And then the question is my assessment better than whoever says that is most likely? And, I hope it is, but that's up to other people to decide.
That's a good answer.
Thank you. Long-winded, but
I hope that was that an original story? Is that the first time you've told that, or is that not the case?
The bit about I walk around the lab at night?
Yes, that part.
It's an epigraph in my first book. I mean, I quoted him saying that.
Okay.
Here's another. One of the fundamental aspects of science, right? There's like hypothesis and test. Then you don't believe anything until it's been independently replicated. So one of my other favorite lines, which I think I also quoted in that book, or at least in a Discover magazine article, came from another Nobel laureate named Sam Ting. And Sam was Chinese. He's at MIT, and he's kind of a phlegmatic guy. And he said, and I'm hoping I'm getting this right, to be first and right in science is good. To be second to be first and wrong is not so good, and to be second and right is meaningless. So basically, we're supposed to not believe anything until it's independently replicated, but nobody really has any motivation to independently replicate anything as far as their career goes, because they're spending a lot of time and energy just demonstrating that maybe somebody else was right. Now, they should want to do it because if they're going to build their work on whether or not that person's right, they want to know if he's really right, and the way to do that is to replicate your work yourself. But anyway, there's a lot of problems with how science is done, and it's kind of a miracle that we've made as much progress as we have. But you got to be skeptical of everything, including every single paper that falls on your desk or you download from PubMed.
Do you think there's a lot of value in self-experimentation, N=1 type of stuff?
Yeah, tremendously, because that tells you what happens to you. Again, it's all about what question you ask, and that's you want to get the answer to the question you ask, and you got to know that it's only the answer to that question. So in my case, the question, my N of 1, if I go on a low-carb, high-fat diet, what happens? What I learned was, I lose weight, I get very healthy, or I appear to be very healthy. I don't know what's happening in my arteries. I don't know. That experiment didn't tell me what will happen if you do it, and it didn't tell me what will happen if my wife does it. It just tells me what happened when I did it. I don't need a randomized controlled trial to tell me whether or not I'll lose weight if I go on this diet, because I went on this diet and I lost weight. That's what I need is a randomized controlled trial to tell me whether I've shortened, give me a probability for whether I've shortened my life or lengthened it. And, the randomized controlled trials say that most likely I am lengthening my life by eating this way compared to, say, the way that low-fat diet or even a calorie-restricted low-fat diet. But again, that's just a probability statement. That doesn't mean I'm not going to drop dead while doing this podcast. And my kids are not going to go to college because my royalties on my books are going to ground to a halt, and that's the end of it. Again, what we get is what's more or less likely, and from these randomized controlled trials, we get probabilities about what's likely to happen to us. It doesn't tell us that is going to happen to us.
So you've published this new book, The Case Against Sugar, which I love the cover, by the way. I noticed that you have different covers for the UK to the US, I believe, and you've got the liquish, like the loose, which is a nice touch. Did you come up with that, or was that your...
that was the UK publishers.
Oh, right.
In the US, we have it looking a little bit more like cocaine.
Yes, I saw, yeah. So would you mind just giving a potted history, and I can imagine this could be quite long, but I guess if you could sort of keep it succinct, of what led you to write The Case Against Sugar, and then just provide a summary of what the book covers for the audience.
Okay, so, my earlier work clearly was... So I start with this analysis of the dietary fat dogma. That goes all the way back to my work for the journal Science in 1999, and the conclusion from a year's worth of investigation and interviews with 150 or so authorities and reading the bulk of the research literature available at the time is that this idea that we should be eating a low-fat diet's ludicrous. Then I do this cover story for the New York Times Magazine. What if it's all been a big fat lie? That was looking at originally I set out to try and figure out what caused the obesity epidemic, and then you end up with kind of putting forth this alternative hypothesis that it's carbohydrates that make us fat, refined grains and sugars and make us fat, and not... If they do, then they cause heart disease and probably diabetes as well, and it's not the fat content of the diet. It's not too many calories. So I spent 5 years working on a book on that. The result is The Diet Delusion in the UK, Good Calories, Bad Calories, again, looking at this, how did we come to believe that dietary fat was the problem? What's this alternative hypothesis where instead of focusing on fat and cholesterol and artery clogging, we're focusing on metabolic syndrome and this whole cluster of metabolic abnormalities that, which insulin resistance appears to be the primary abnormality, and how that's related to carbs and sugars, and how we maybe should have interpreted that data if we weren't locked in so tightly on fat and cholesterol. And then finally, this idea that there's an alternative hypothesis of obesity. It's not about eating too much or exercising too little. It's a hormonal dysregulation of fat accumulation. And again, the carbs have become the prime suspect. After that book, I wrote the airplane reading version of it because that book was, 500 pages and a dense read, and, people just who needed it weren't getting through it, and I could clearly understand that. So, and all this time, I'm talking about the influence of sugar and the possibility that sugar might be the sort of fundamental trigger. As we talked about before, you've got Southeast Asians eating high-carb diets and eating, white rice or at least brown rice in significant amounts, and eating wheat bread in significant amounts, wheat flour. And so what happens to them? Why do they only become obese and diabetic, when they go through a nutrition transition if they're already eating refined grains? And the simplest answer is they used to be eating very little sugar, and then you add sugar to any diet, including theirs, and you get insulin resistance. So that was the rationale. People kept saying, well, what about Southeast Asia, dude? And I would say, well, it's probably the sugar. So I decided to look into this question of the role sugar might play, and the argument is pretty simple. As I said, what we want to do is explain the observation that you see obesity and diabetes epidemics anywhere in the world when you go through a nutrition transition, and you could find populations that went through nutrition transitions pretty early in history and started manifesting obesity and diabetes, but didn't have the kind of processed, chemical-laden food industry we have today that people like to blame the problem on. So, Natal Indians in South Africa in the 50s, or Yemenite Jews in Israel in the 50s, or even the Native American tribe, the Sioux, living on reservations here in the late 1920s. And so you could say, look, here are populations where the only thing that changed in their diet is that sugar consumption increased dramatically, or in the case of the Sioux, sugar, and they got lard from the U.S. government as well. But you can use these populations to begin to rule out suspects. And the way I think of it is you've got a crime being committed everywhere in the world, a very similar crime being committed everywhere. And, if we could rule out suspects, we're going to assume from the get-go that it's always being committed by the same one individual, one aspect of the diet, because that's Occam's razor. Start with the simplest possible hypothesis. And if we could find populations where we could rule out, say, ultra processing and bliss points in the food, and the food additives, and we can find populations where we could rule out antidepressants, we could rule out artificial sweeteners because they didn't exist in these populations, we could find populations where we could rule out trans fats because they didn't exist in these populations, and we still had the crime being committed. The only suspect I could find that's always at the scene of the crime is sugar. And then we got a mechanism, we got an organ that seems to be where it all starts. The crime seems to begin in the liver, with fat accumulation in liver cells, hepatocytes, and that seems to drive liver, hepatic insulin resistance, which then becomes systemic insulin resistance. At least that's a reasonable hypothesis accepted by a lot of people who study this. And it just so happens that the fructose component of sugar is metabolized in the liver, and when we dump fructose on the liver in high doses, it turns it into fat. So the actual trials trying to demonstrate that sugar is responsible are ambiguous, although it seems to certainly cause insulin resistance in some people in these trials. But these are short-term trials trying to study long-term effects. So sugar's always at the scene of the crime on a population level. It's working at the scene of the crime on a physiological level. It's got a gun available, this hepatic metabolism of fructose that could certainly commit the crime. Hard to see the gun smoking. But that's the argument. It's like it should be the prime suspect. That's what I keep saying. And then the question becomes, why isn't it the prime suspect? And I talk a lot about the history of sugar and the bad science committed by the diabetes researchers and the nutrition researchers and the obesity researchers who just, I've said critical things about them in the past, and studying the history of sugar doesn't make me think any more kindly about their ability to do good science. And I talk about the influence of the sugar industry, which, like any industry, was vigorously defending its product against claims that it was doing harm. And they were taking the bad science that the nutritionists gave them and the obesity researchers gave them and the diabetes researchers gave them and saying, hey, look, sugar's harmless because that's what these bad scientists thought. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Good stuff. I love the analogy of the gun. I thought that was very creative. How do you, in terms of getting people off sugar and sort of weaning them off it, how do you do that? Have you thought about that? How we would, I guess, as a populace, wean people off sugar, and then how long, I suppose, does it then take to eliminate the cravings?
Well, and I don't know. I think everyone's different as far as the cravings. I think that the way the cravings manifest themselves are different. My writing of this book was informed by two facts, and I can't avoid either one of them. One of them is that I'm a father of two pre-adolescent boys, and they live in a sugar-rich environment, and they know their father's a zealot. And thank God they have a sense of humor that they inherited as much from their mother or more from their mother than they did from me. So they could deal with their father, the zealot. And I was a smoker, okay? So I was a cigarette smoker. I have a Nicorette here, one of two that I chew today, or half of a Nicorette that I will probably chew over the course of this podcast. I quit smoking 18 years ago. When you're a smoker, I never smoked more than about half a pack a day, Marlboro Lights, because I was health conscious smoker. Even half a pack a day, that's 10 cigarettes a day. That's a cigarette when you wake up in the morning. It's a cigarette after breakfast. It's a cigarette as you walk to work or to your car to get to work. It's a cigarette on your break, after lunch, on your second break, after dinner, between courses at your dinner, back when you were allowed to smoke, before dessert, after dessert, and then if you're lucky enough, you get an 11th after sex, okay? When you get angry, you have a cigarette to calm down. When you get happy, you have a cigarette to reward yourself. When you're emotional, you smoke. When you're sad, you smoke. I was married briefly in my youth to a woman, and our first date, basically what we did together was one of those 36-hour dates, and we smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And half the reason the marriage didn't work is because all we did well was smoke. And the point is that when you're a smoker, it's like you cannot imagine life without cigarettes any more than we can imagine today enjoyable life without getting to reward ourselves with sweets. And then you quit. And I tried to quit effectively every day for 20 years. I mean, sometimes I would wake up in the morning and think, I'm not going to smoke today because I don't like the way your mouth tastes awful in the morning and you're coughing. And sometimes I'd succeed for 10 minutes, and sometimes I'd succeed for an hour, and occasionally I'd succeed till after lunch. And, a few times I'd succeed for a couple days. Sometimes I'd succeed for a few weeks, a few months. Once or twice I succeeded for a year. Now I'm succeeding for 17 or 18 years. 17
Congratulations.
Years. Thank you. The first 3 weeks are miserable. I mean, they are miserable. You are craving cigarettes all day long, and I think that's different than it is with sugar, and we'll get to that. The first 3 months, I used to warn people after I got used to it. I had like 15 years in of trying and failing to quit. I'd say, look, I'm going to quit smoking, and I'm probably going to alienate you, and I'm going to overreact to something you say, and I'm going to bite your head off, or I'm going to be like depressed and moping, and when we go out, please, bear with me, okay? Don't let this ruin our friendship. It's important that I quit, and I apologize. And then the first year, you're just kind of generally, never that happy because all your emotions were modulated through cigarettes. I mean, it was like the resistor in the circuit of your brain. And then after a while, by 2 years out, 3 years out, you can't imagine that you ever smoked. And today, despite the Nicorettes, I cannot imagine smoking a cigarette. It's got nothing to do with whether or not I'm happy or unhappy, and it's just sort of something, it's almost like this 20-year period of insanity in which my brain was hijacked by nicotine, which is a very powerful drug. Right. I think the same is going to be true with sugar, and I have reason to think that because of all the anecdotal experience, both my own and that of other people. Clearly, people will get over the craving, and eventually they'll get to the point where their happiness in life is not dependent on a sugar treat. It's not like going out to dinner with your friends will only be meaningful if you get dessert. You could get a cheese plate instead, or if you're somebody like me, you could have, or you perhaps, a big ribeye with a nice fatty sauce on it, and that'll make you happy. It doesn't have to be a sweet. So I think the same thing can happen. I know people for whom the same thing happened, including me. What I was going to say about the difference is, for many of us, like for me, out of sight is out of mind. If I don't have cravings for sugar unless I see it or smell it. And if I see a dessert that I like, or my wife is eating ice cream, then the craving kicks up. But as long as it's out of sight, I don't miss it at all. And then the struggle comes when it's sitting there on the table or in the refrigerator. If I know that I have, some sweet thing in the house that I like, I'm having even in my office, which is on the third floor of this big old rambling house we live in Oakland, I'm having a discussion with this sweet that's in the refrigerator that one of our friends brought over. And if we have a party, I don't know if you have a party and they bring dessert and then they want to leave it with you. Yeah. And it's like, get that thing out of the house. And they'll take offense. I'll say, no, it's not that I didn't like it. If I didn't like it, you could leave it here. Because I liked it, I want you to take it home with you and get it. And as soon as it's out of the house, I'm okay. And I'm sure alcoholics are the same with alcohol. Once they've gotten through the immediate withdrawal period, they're, out of sight is out of mind. The danger for them falling off the wagon is when not when they're sitting at home watching television, when they're at a bar with their friends trying not to drink while their friends are. Then the same with smoking. The only way I could quit smoking successfully was to move to Los Angeles, where nobody smoked. If you wanted to bum a cigarette from someone, you had to honk your horn and ask them to roll down the window. Just...
Excuse me. Yeah, changing your environment sounds like the trick there. But just out of interest, does anyone ever buy you chocolates for birthday or Christmas? Or are they smarter than that?
I have friends now who give me 100% chocolate that they really like. But it's not sugared chocolate. My wife, has a literary agent who will send her, although we didn't get it this year, the classic fruit cake. Maybe you guys don't have this in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm wondering if the fruit cake became such a classic, because it's, even when I was eating sugar, who likes that stuff,
Some people, but not a lot, I don't think.
But I was just on this book tour, and the number of people who would say, would you like a cup of coffee? And I would say yes. Like, you'd go in to do an interview, and the assistant would offer you a cup of coffee, and then she would start to say, do you take cream or shh? And then realize that the answer is going to be no. My kids we had come back from vacation with their grandparents who load them up on sugar. So it always takes a while for them to get off the sugar craving and sugar high of these Christmas vacations. And sitting at the dining room table, and my youngest, who's 8, said after we were finishing, my wife was out with some friends, so I had made them dinner, and my youngest, who was 8, said, at the end of the meal, is there dessert? And my oldest son said, Nick, it's Dad, man. There's no dessert. Anyway.
That's brilliant. Actually, that's a neat segue into a question from a listener whose Twitter handle is not Matt Carstens. I don't know if his name's Matt. Apparently not. I don't really understand his handle, but very sort of loyal follower on the Twitter there. He asks, how do you deal with living a normal life and raising kids, with sugar being so ubiquitous? Like, how do you, for instance, you mentioned there that your kids, they consume all this sugar and then they come back. Because I'm assuming you don't say to them, no, you can't have sugar. It's more of I'm guessing more you empower them to make their own decisions. But I'd love to hear how you sort of manage that and raise your kids and in that sense.
I try to empower them, and I'm assuming that I'm empowering them to be good adults, just like you do to make the right decisions in every aspect of life. We live in Oakland, California, where marijuana is effectively legal, and I'm waiting for my oldest, I assume sometime, he's 11, sometime in the next 2 years, someone's going to give him a, marijuana candy, and whether he knows it or not, we're going to have a stoned 13-year-old on our hands. And I'm not adverse to mind-altering drugs, but I'd prefer that they wait until they're older before they make their decision. So you try to inform your kids with everything, right? My youngest particularly has a sweet tooth, and he knows what I think, and he may or may not believe it in some profound way. But when presented with sweets, he will overeat them. Actually, any carbs. The kid could eat his, a head full of pasta if you let him. So we just, we don't have sodas in the house and fruit juices in the house, and they don't get desserts after meals. And they're used to it. They're fine with it. It's just the norm. If they go out, I'm sure they pig out. I mean, if I'm at a party and they're at the party, I'll usually find myself standing around the sweets table so that I can make sure my youngest only goes back 3 times and not 6 or 7. And he's capable of doing 6 or 7. If he really had a weight problem, if he looked like he was predisposed to get fat, which he doesn't, I would probably be a little more zealous about it. But I just try to keep it under control. And when they're out, they're out. I have faith that my oldest will make good decisions. My youngest has he's got a craving for sugar that he has trouble controlling, and I just hope as he gets older, we'll deal with that.
Do you get sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's we went out. I was delegated to do the trick-or-treating with my youngest over Halloween while my wife went with my oldest. And so you go to a party where there are sweets, and then they go trick-or-treating in their neighborhood. And at the end of the night, my youngest was down in one of the basement rooms of this house with one of his friends, and they were like holding the corner going through their candy because they knew that this was it. And maybe I wouldn't find him until he could get to the end of the bag. And when I do, he's pretty good about it. But I have a friend who's a very well-known nutrition writer here who even though he's doesn't believe in demonizing single nutrients, said that even for him, sort of moderating his children's sugar consumption was a dominant theme of parenting. I use that line in my book without quoting him. I think that's what we do as parents. We moderate their sugar consumption and now their screen consumption, and we try to keep it reasonable without driving them away from us.
That's the balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah, that's balancing.
Good stuff. Okay, that's makes sense then actually to ask you a couple of questions about diet quickly. You mentioned in another interview you don't do well with moderation. So am I right in saying that you just never consume sugar? Are you completely off it, or are there the odd occasion perhaps?
Yeah, well, there are two issues there. One is me personally, and yeah, I find it easier not to eat any sugar at all than to eat it in moderation. And by that I mean on a meal-to-meal basis. So taking a bite of a tasty dessert that, you go to someone's house and it's a birthday party, and yeah, I've had this happen where their daughter has cooked pies for their birthday and cakes for their birthday, and I don't want any, and they act like I'm a spoil sport who I once got a lecture from a friend about this was the problem with Americans in general, is that they can't deal with moderation. It was like, I said, it's just easier for me personally not to eat any of this stuff, because if I have one bite, I am going to want to eat all of it. And I assume that, physiologically, it's probably very similar to an alcoholic with alcohol, whereas if they have one sip, suddenly something is fired in their brain and maybe in their liver as well, and now they crave alcohol at a point that they can't stop. So it's just easier to have none. I think the same is true of cigarettes, but I think the actual, immediate craving that ignites upon that first bite or that first sip, I think is far more analogous to alcoholism. So I find it easier not to. Doesn't mean, I like to fly Virgin American Airlines because they have these chocolate macaroon treats that I can get for free if I get upgraded to, premium coach where you get leg room. And they're, made of almond flour and coconut oil, and so they're all very paleo friendly, and they have a little bit of honey in them, and I will eat them, but I know I'm only going to be on the flight for 5 hours. I'm not going to have 6 bags, even though I can get 6 bags for free and the main cabin select. But so there are ways that I moderate, but I'm not, it's not a 100% zero thing. It's just meal to meal. It's easier not to. And if I don't have stuff I like in the house, it's not speaking to me. I'm not thinking, oh, great, when I get off this, should I cut off the podcast with Lawrence because I got that paleo treat sitting in the freezer crying out to me. Then I have issues. The last chapter in the book, I have issues with moderation in general, with what that even means. Yeah. If you've got, we don't talk about smoking cigarettes in moderation because we know smoking causes lung cancer. In fact, we don't say too much smoking causes lung cancer, even though assuredly too much smoking does cause lung cancer. We just say smoking causes it. And if the argument I make in the book is correct, that sugar causes obesity and diabetes, just raises issues about not only how we discuss it, but then how you respond to it. So instead of a doctor or a nutritionist or a dietitian or, well-meaning book reviewer, syndicated book reviewer from the Washington Post who's earned my ire lately, it's like telling your kids to eat in moderation. You wouldn't tell them to smoke cigarettes in moderation, even if you thought that cigarettes weren't powerfully addictive, because we say cigarettes cause lung cancer. It changes what the concept means, both, A, if it is addictive, and many people won't be able to stay with moderate consumption, and B, if it's a fundamental cause of it and we don't know at what level it's safe. Like I could probably smoke I'm 99% confident that I could smoke 2 or 4 cigarettes a day and not get lung cancer. But I'm still not going to do it, even if I think I could stay at 4 cigarettes a day. Yeah. Because I feel like I'm healthier without it.
Yeah, that's pretty profound, actually.
That's my business, profundity.
Yeah. I think I'm going to wait to read that chapter after my cheat day tomorrow. So
there we go.
Cool. Okay, so I guess switching gears slightly, because I promised my friend who's a massive fan of your work that I'd ask some of his questions. So his question to you is, do you think the diet wars are actually winnable? And would it be more worthwhile putting effort into fighting for funding for, say, cancer research and ketogenic diets? If you could prove ketogenic diets to be therapeutic in cancer, then maybe you could win the diet wars, plus also make huge advancements in cancer treatment. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a good question. I've always thought that there are multiple fronts on which this diet war has to be fought. So there are two questions we want to answer. We want to ask. One is, what's the trigger to these epidemics? Because if you identify the trigger unambiguously, we know what has to be curbed to prevent the epidemic. And today we think the trigger is, too much energy available, too much food available, and sedentary behavior. So if it can be demonstrated that, sugars and white flour are what causes the epidemic, or even sugars alone, then it's hard to argue that you shouldn't seriously restrict sugar consumption. The second issue is, what's the healthiest diet for those of us who are predisposed to become metabolically disturbed? And what your friend is suggesting is even, and I argue this in my books, and other people have taken this and run with it far greater than I have, this implication that not only does sugar and insulin resistance and high blood sugar and insulin-like growth factor drive cancer growth, but that if you remove all the carbohydrates, you can inhibit cancer growth, maybe not only prevent it, but maybe, reverse it or cure cancers that would otherwise be intractable. I've always thought, and part of the idea with the Nutrition Science Initiative was that the second battle can be fought on all fronts, because one of the nutrition, obesity, medical research people think that these ketogenic diets people can't stick to them, the high fat's going to give them heart disease, the high saturated fat's going to kill them, they should be, and if they work because they restrict calories, so any diet that restricts calories will do the same thing regardless of its composition. There's a whole slew of sort of institutionalized defense mechanisms that have them very hesitant to even entertain the idea that these diets happen to be kind of uniquely effective. So any area where we think you can have an effect that's profound, whether it's in cancer treatment or we're just put together a proposal on ketogenic diets in type 1 diabetes, or there's a rare form of obesity, a genetic defect called Prader-Willi syndrome, where ketogenic diets seem to be uniquely effective, or type 2 diabetes is an obvious one, or even, cognitive disorders like depression and other issues. Anywhere where you can show that these diets are really tremendously effective, if indeed they are, you'll begin to break down resistance to people using them in other areas. Cancer is an obvious place to go. And at NUSI, before we went through our current difficulties, we were going to fund one of the only animal experiments, I hope the only animal experiment that we ever funded, but it would use human tumors. So it was to begin to explore this possibility. A lot of people are studying the effects of ketogenic diets. What worries me about those trials is, with luck, in a well-designed trial, you would be able to demonstrate that you could prevent, let's say in a breast cancer model with adjuvant therapy. So you have individuals, you take individuals who have had breast cancer, and then you randomize them to usual care versus usual care plus a ketogenic diet, whatever usual care is, and then you would hope that you could prevent recurrence of the cancer by such a large extent that you would demonstrate something that had never even been demonstrated with drug therapy, or when it was demonstrated with drug therapy was considered like a huge advance in treatment. But that you could actually prevent recurrence, or increase the likelihood of making someone cancer-free who already has cancer is, a risky thing to do, because I think we can't underestimate the ability of tumors to utilize, their proliferation of their cells and to take advantage of evolution. So to evolve a way around so that even they go from being fueled primarily on glucose to being fueled, for instance, primarily by the ketones that you're now feeding it. That makes me nervous, and you can imagine trials being done that fail to show a meaningful benefit and then are used to argue that low-carb, high-fat diets wouldn't prevent cancer, or that sugar and refined grains are necessary to create a homeostatic milieu that fuels cancer. So again, you have to be very careful what questions you're asking, and you have to design the trials in such a way that you don't set yourself up for failure, in effect, and set yourself up for a situation where, and God knows I'm speaking, we did this with Nusi, where we had problems with the trials, and suddenly we're, rather than shedding more light on it, we've created even more challenges for ourselves if we're right.
Good stuff. Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering, again, another question from Fred Hahn, who's a follower of the podcast. Are there any randomized control trials that showed that compared isocaloric low-carb, high-fat diets to high-carb, low-fat diets in which protein intake is identical, and where the low-carb, high-fat diet proved more effective for fat loss?
Are there isocaloric trials where protein is fixed? Well, for them to be isocaloric and for protein to be fixed, they have to be inpatient trials. And my understanding, when I looked at that literature, at one point we had about 85 such studies discussed on the Nusi website. I don't think that's there anymore. Typically, when they did those trials, they would calorie restrict both diets. So you would make the assumption that in order for people to lose weight, they have to eat less. Then now you feed them 800 calories of a low-carb, high-fat diet and versus 800 calories of a higher-carb, low-fat diet, without thinking that if these were obese individuals, they might have been eating 2,500 to 3,000 or more calories to begin with. So the low-carb diet might have 200 calories of carbs or 100 calories of carbs, and the high-carb diet might have 300 calories of carbs, reduced from the 1,500 they were eating to begin with. Neither diet has sugar anymore, and so you end up with a situation where you have to ask, would we expect there to be a result? And my answer would be not particularly, like a differential between the two diets, although I would still expect the lower carb diet, the individuals on the lower carb diet, to be less hungry for reasons we could discuss. The number to keep in mind and why we get fat, I had a chapter called 20 calories a day. So remember, if we're asking the question, what triggers obesity to begin with, as opposed to the question of what diet should we be on to reverse the problem, if the point I make in my lectures, if you're storing 20 calories of fat a day in your fat tissue that you're not burning, okay, so that's 220 calories a day equates to 2 pounds of fat stored every year. And that's 20 pounds a decade and 40 pounds in 2 decades. So Nusi recently funded a study, Energy Balance Consortium pilot study. The principal investigator was Kevin Hall. And they claimed, it was kind of an odd situation, but the paper they wrote was made the argument that this somehow refuted the insulin carbohydrate hypothesis of obesity. And then there were some letters that went back and forth to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by David Ludwig, who's a believer of this hypothesis, and Kevin Hall. And the letter back from Kevin Hall to David Ludwig made a point that they had decided in advance that the smallest possible clinically significant effect they could see would be 150 calories per day in energy expenditure would be, if this other mechanism right, 150 calories a day stored in fat tissue. And they said that anything smaller than that was clinically insignificant and irrelevant. But that 150 calories is the equivalent of about 15 pounds of fat gain per year, which would be, if the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis is correct, 150 pounds of fat put on every decade. Yeah. And when I read this, I was kind of stunned because they clearly didn't phrase it like that to us, or we would have made the point that 150 calories a day is a huge effect. I mean, in order to gain 150 pounds of fat a year, we got to seriously, we got to put a tumor in your hypothalamus and then let you eat, extraordinary amounts of food because you're fat. Anyway, so that's the point. Even this very supposedly carefully controlled study that we funded, in order for the researchers to explain their results as refuting our hypothesis, they had to make this absurd statement that only 150 kcal a day is an insignificant effect, when it's a huge effect. And all these other trials suffered the same problem. So you have to figure out how to design an experiment where you minimize what's called a type 2 error, which is an error where you miss an effect that exists, as opposed to type 1, which is finding an effect that doesn't. And in order to do that, when you know that the smallest effect you can see it would be physiologically huge, it takes a lot more care and thought than we even put into that first study. All these other studies and what Fred's talking about, they're not going to see the size of effect we're talking about. And again, we're hoping still that we can get trials funded that at least have some shot at seeing this kind of huge effect, which is still right at the border of what's observable in these studies.
Yeah, it's a good question from Fred to send you on that that one there. And Fred, I should also mention, was on the podcast as well. Excellent interview we did on high intensity training. I wanted to. Why have you, Gary? I wanted to ask you some questions on exercise, since, Corporate Warrior has become fairly popular. As we often discuss, the high-intensity training made popular by Arthur Jones. And I wanted to ask you if you practiced high-intensity strength training at all in your own exercise regimen, and what it is that you do for exercise.
Okay, well, I did. I worked out with Fred for a year when I was living in New York. Oh, okay. And I'm a big sweaty Jewish guy, so if I could do some kind of high-intensity exercise that doesn't leave me soaked in sweat at the end and all the other people in the gym kind of grossed out by what's happening, I'm all for it. When I moved from New York to the Bay Area in California, I still do some high-intensity, but I don't work out that much, in part because I could look like I work out a lot, using various tricks that I've learned from people like Fred and like, you guys in this community. So I have a Concept 2 ergometer that I work out on. I do 20 minutes a day, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and I do it to failure. I have a chin-up bar, a pull-up bar that I put up on my way to my office, and I'll do some variation of about 50 pull-ups, couple times a week. I have I have 2 counters in my kitchen that happen to be just perfectly distanced so I could do dips. And sometimes I'll do slow burn dips. Sometimes I'll do, 5-second dips. That's pretty much it. I'll go to the gym recently because I was reading Christ, Serious Strength. What's his name? Mark Ripito.
Yes.
I've been experimenting with getting back to doing deadlifts and squats, because I have a lower back problem that I would like to fix, but I also have a knee that hasn't had cartilage in it since 1974.
Right.
And it makes me a bit nervous, but I've been experimenting with that as well. But that's once a week when I have to take my oldest son to swim team practice, and he swims at my gym. So it's probably about an hour and a half a week total on a good week. And like I said, I look like I'm in great shape, whether I am or not. Depends what which exercise we're talking about.
That's good stuff.
I cannot run anymore, but that's more a product of the lack of cartilage in the knee and the degenerative arthritis there. And
how did that happen in the first place?
American football. Actually, tackle football on the beach originally. Tackle frisbee on the beach originally with friends between before my freshman year in college, and then I tore it in college the year before arthroscopic surgery came in. So back then, they would cut you open, remove the cartilage, and it was 6 weeks in a cast and a year of rehab. The year after, my best friend had the same injury, and it was arthroscopic surgery by the same surgeon. And, it was up and around in like 3 weeks. I was being tortured by physical therapists at my university medical center for like 9 months afterwards, trying to undo the damage. And pretty much anyone who had that surgery ends up with a knee exactly like mine. Although actually many of them might have had knee replacements already. I'm holding off.
Why is that?
Pain. Yeah. Actually, I've just been too busy. I don't want to. I mean, it's only been lately when I started doing the dips, the squats, and the deadlifts and also my youngest son likes to play tennis, and I would like to play with him. And if I could actually, move on that leg reliably, it would be more fun playing tennis. As it is, he's still 8, so I can still hop to most balls, but it would be interesting to actually be able to run on that knee.
What about how did you how did you get the sort of pain in your back? Is that from excessive sitting, or again sports back in the day, or?
I don't actually know. One of the issues, it could be the concept too, because again, I tend to do sprints, and it could be age. I just turned 60. The problem with getting older is things that we used to work out through suddenly become things that are just defective and stay defective for life. Again, because of the knee, my right leg doesn't straighten fully, and I've also had, my left foot is completely flat. Who knows?
Right.
Hopefully that won't need surgery for this, but we'll see. And we'll see how the deadlifts and squats work. But I might have to get the knee fixed so I can do those right. So.
Sure. Good stuff. Well, you seem, well, it's not good, but you seem quite content, or you don't seem too bothered by it from your demeanor.
No, it's all good. Again, aging is interesting. I mean, because of the knee, I just slowly there were things I couldn't do in life. I used to have a weekly softball game in Central Park in New York, and I went from playing center field when I was still like 42 or 43 to, by the time I was 52 or 53, volunteering to catch. And then if I got on base, I've always been a power hitter. I would then have it's a pickup game. I would immediately volunteer for a pinch runner because I didn't particularly want to run around the bases anymore. So it is what it is. On the other hand, I can do more pull-ups and dips now than I could do when I was in college playing football. So that's what I meant by how you define, whether or not I'm in good shape.
Interesting. I meant to ask you this earlier, but I'd love to hear could you give us a typical snapshot of a day's eating for you? Like just to give us an idea of the sort of diet you eat?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's breakfast is always the same thing for the past past year or so. I've been having salmon salad from my local fish shop. So this isn't, like salmon on top of greens. It's the kind of salmon salad that's like tuna salad you might put in a sandwich, and I'll have that, and with a couple strips of bacon. And when I'm traveling, I have eggs and bacon and sausage for breakfast, and lunch is usually like chicken salad or tuna salad that I'll eat out of the bin instead of putting on bread, because that's just how I am and I'm happy with it. And dinner is some kind of meat, fish, or fowl and green vegetables. And when I'm traveling, it's, lunch will also be some kind of meat, fish, or fowl, and I'll ask them to hold the potatoes and give me a green salad or vegetables instead. So there's a lot of vegetables, a lot of greens, because not that I necessarily know they're healthy, but my mother told me to eat my vegetables when I was a kid. And I eat 100% chocolate for a snack. I eat nuts for a snack. It's kind of whether it's paleo or Atkins, low carb, high fat, depends on probably how much butter I'm using that day. I've recently gotten addicted to bulletproof coffees, which worry me a bit, and I want to talk to Asprey about that, because again, I don't think we evolved to consume, piping hot butter and MCT oil with caffeine, but definitely helps you wake up in the morning. So, and it tastes good.
Yeah, placebo or not, I feel I have the same effect, and I get a lot of pushback recently announcing that on social media. I wasn't very popular for that.
Well, again, this is what I mean by what you learn from an N of 1 experiment. Like, I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine, so I can very easily get to the point where I could drink a pot of coffee and then take a nap 5 minutes later. Clearly, when I have the bulletproof coffee, like 10 ounces of coffee, 12 ounces of coffee, and 7 in the morning will keep me going till noon, which will not happen without the bulletproof. And I know that, that's just my own experience. Like, it could be a placebo effect, but it's pretty consistent, and I doubt it. On the other hand, is it killing me? That I don't know. That I need a randomized controlled trial for, and we don't have any.
But I assume you probably get your bloods tested you track your sort of
actually, I don't. I'm not one of those people. About once every 4 years, I'm talking to some doctor, or my former colleague Peter Attia would say, "Let's get those bloods checked," and they're good. It doesn't really worry me. So.
Huge fan of Peter, by the way. If you ever get a chance to speak to him in the near future, I'd love to have him on, because I know he's a fan. I'm pretty sure he's a fan of high intensity training, but incredibly busy, successful individual. So hard to get hold of. Yeah,
he's a tough one to nail down these days.
He did actually come back to me on email, which I was very surprised, because you always feel surprised, I suppose, when you approach someone high profile, especially at that time this podcast wasn't getting many downloads at all. And he responded. It was very blunt. It was Lawrence, no time, and that was it. Yeah. I was like, you know what? I'm grateful you responded, so it's all good.
Well, Peter's very much more. He's. Maybe I think it's just the way Peter always was. He's much better organized, and I have I'll do anything I can to get people to understand these arguments, whereas Peter is understand, he wants to get the really influential people to understand it. I want to get everyone to understand it.
Got it. Yeah. Understood. Conscious of time, so there's a lot here I won't go through, but there is a couple I'd love to ask you, and I've got to ask you this one now. If you go back and give your 20-year-old self some advice, what would you say? And if you could give us context, that would be great, if possible.
You mean other than when I was waiting in line for the restroom at a party at Wellesley College to wait and talk to the tall brunette in front of me instead of the strawberry blonde, who I did end up spending a year with, who I'm very fond of, but I let the brunette was spectacular. Yeah, that's when I was 20. Okay, that's why. Actually, I got the advice, because you asked two questions in email, and I got the advice when I was 20 that I would give. That was the advice I needed to hear. So I was between my junior and senior year in colleges, I went to Hawaii for the summer. And I wanted to get away from all the Ivy League nonsense. And I had a cousin out there, an aunt out there, and a cousin. And my cousin had been in the intelligence services in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and a very impressive guy. And he got me a job bouncing at a nightclub on Waikiki Beach. And I don't know how he knew this about me, because I was at Harvard at the time. And I thought it was relatively easy to get at Harvard. It was easy for me to get A's. I was playing football. I was relatively good. And somehow he diagnosed me as someone who is willing to get by as just being good enough. And he gave me a lecture that being good enough wasn't good enough, and that I had to work my ass off to be as good as I could possibly be. And again, I'm amazed that he was able to see this just over the course of the summer, but maybe it was his military training. He diagnosed me as being basically a screw-up who managed to get by in life on native intelligence and athletic talent without working at it, and he convinced me to work at it. And when I finally got into a situation where I was studying something that really I really liked, which was journalism and investigative reporting, it was his words that kept resonating when I started doing 70, 80, 90-hour work weeks, because I didn't want to just be good enough. And so that's the advice I got when I was 20, and I'm the advice that I'm glad I got then.
That's really good advice. I have to ask you this. I always tend to ask the question quite a lot, but I'm particularly interested in your response. What have you changed your mind about in the last year in relation to nutrition?
In the last year?
Yeah,
well, I gave in and started consuming bulletproof coffees, even though I worried that they're going to kill me. What else?
If anything, I appreciate it. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, the past year is a tough one. Again, doing what I do, we tend to, I'm so skeptical that it would take me more than a year just to decide that I'm wrong about something, or decide that I'm right about something. So I work on time spans of about 5 years. Like if you go back to reading my first New York Times Magazine infamous cover story about obesity, and it was called "What If Fat Doesn't Make You Fat?" And there was a line in there where I said, clearly obesity is caused by consuming more calories than we expend. And now I think that's inane. And then my other books have been, about the effects of all sugars and refined carbs. And clearly with this latest book, I think that sugar is the fundamental trigger. But again, if you're obese or diabetic, you're going to want to, or predisposed to become that way. That doesn't mean you only restrict sugar. It means you've got to still get rid of most to all of the easily digestible carbs. Yeah, that's about all I can say. I don't think I haven't made any dramatic changes, and clearly a lot of people think I should, but not in the past year, no.
No problem. All right, okay, so Gary, what's the best way for people to find out more about you, what you're up to?
Well, I would like to say my blog, GaryTaubes.com, but I do not. Ever since we started Nusi back in 2012, I haven't had time to blog. I have been tweeting more often, mostly about the sugar book. So at the moment, all you'll get is, where I'm speaking next, in my hopes that I don't end up sitting in front of a, mostly empty room, giving my talks or my readings. But that's pretty much it. The New C website hasn't been updated in a while because of the troubles we've been having with funding. So we hope we'll solve that and things will get better. And I do hope to begin to, learn the trick of writing shorter blogs so I can do them more, more frequently. Sure. But I haven't learned it yet.
Good stuff. Okay, so I guess for all the show notes and links, including links to Gary's new book, The Case Against Sugar, go to corpwarrior.com, and that'll redirect you to the homepage, 15minutecorporatewarrior.com. And you'll probably need to search Gary Taubes, Taubes, and it'll pop straight up. Please also remember to subscribe, and you will automatically receive each new episode, and that would really help me out too. So Gary, I want to be sort of respectful of your time, and thank you so much for taking the time in your day to be on Corporate Warrior. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Take care.
Take care. Cheers, Gary. Bye now. This episode is brought to you by hituni.com. If you haven't been a long-time listener and had the upsides of high-intensity training drilled into your brain, HIT has dramatically reduced my exercise volume to sub 30 minutes per week, while helping me build more muscle and reduce my body fat to 10%, which in turn has enabled me to do more with my time, like play sports that I love, build businesses, and play more Call of Duty. Who wouldn't want that? So what has this got to do with HIT Uni? HitUni.com are providers of amazing online courses that teach you all about high-intensity training. There's a course for newbies that will show you how to optimize your workouts to build more muscle, burn more fat, and improve overall health. And the bulk of the courses are designed to qualify you to become a high-intensity training personal trainer and equip you with all the knowledge and business skills you need to build a successful fitness business. HIT Uni comes highly recommended by Body by Science author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, Drew Bay, and Medex Precision Fitness owner Blair Wilson. It was founded by author and one of the UK's leading personal trainers, Simon Shawcross, who's been training people for 15 years and has supervised over 15,000 workouts. With help from contributors like Jimmy Moore, Dr. James Steele, and Edward Harrison, and inspiration from Arthur Jones, Dr. Ellington Darden, Ken Hutchins, Mike Mensa, HIT Uni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's an online support and discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. I personally used HIT Uni to build my own stunning physique, just kidding, but I have purchased a course to improve my understanding of HIT and improve my own results. The content is amazing, the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organised into these bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement as you tick off each one. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's hituni.com, and enter the coupon code CW10. So again, head on over to hituni.com, choose your course, and enter the coupon code CW10. Thank you for your support.